Owen Carr has been my attorney for 22 years. He handled my business acquisitions, my contracts, my one messy partnership dispute in 2009, and my divorce in 2017. He is methodical and careful, and he has a habit of pausing before he speaks that used to frustrate me when I was younger and impatient and now strikes me as one of the better qualities a man in his profession can have. He warned me about Diana Valdez in April of 2023. He looked across his desk at me, took that pause of his, and said, "Blake, the documentation here is not adequate, and the investment structure does not make sense to me. I think you should be very careful." I looked back at him and said I appreciated his concern and that I understood the situation better than the paperwork reflected. I walked out of his office and sent Diana $165,000 3 days later. 6 months after that, he warned me again. I ignored him again. And by the time I was ready to admit that Owen Carr had been right about everything from the very first conversation, Diana Valdez was gone. $265,000 of my money was gone with her, and I had spent the better part of a year treating the one professional in my life who was actively trying to protect me like an obstacle I needed to navigate around. That is the story. That is the part of it I am most ashamed of. Not the money. The fact that I had help and I refused it. My name is Blake Richardson, 70 years old. I built and sold 2 mid-sized commercial real estate businesses in Austin over a 30-year career, which left me comfortable and experienced and, I believed, reasonably difficult to fool. I retired in 2020, at 67, with the intention of finally slowing down after 3 decades of deals and deadlines and the particular exhaustion that comes from building things in a competitive market. My wife Carol passed in 2019, a year before I retired, and the combination of her death and the end of my working life left me in an apartment in Austin that felt 3 sizes too large for one person. I am not a man who processes grief outwardly. I work, or I used to. When the work stopped and Carol was already gone, I found myself in a quiet that I did not know how to fill. I started traveling in 2021, not purposefully at first, just moving, which is easier than staying still when staying still means sitting with the fullness of what is absent. I went to Portugal, to Japan, to New Zealand. In early 2022, a friend suggested the Philippines. He had been twice and said it was warm and affordable and full of life in a way that could pull a man out of his own head if he let it. I landed in Manila in March of 2022 with no particular plan and 2 weeks on my calendar and the low-grade hope that a change of geography might do something useful for the way I had been feeling. Manila was chaotic in the way of cities that have no interest in apologizing for their own energy. I found it more engaging than exhausting, which surprised me. I stayed 2 weeks, extended to 4, and by the end of the month I had found a rhythm that felt, if not like happiness exactly, then at least like forward motion. I came back 6 months later. By 2023, I was spending 3 months a year there, had a preferred apartment in a building near Bonifacio Global City, and had developed the kind of loose social network that forms naturally when you are an American retiree in a place with a well-established expat community, people you eat with, people you trade recommendations with, people who become friends without quite having gone through the process of becoming friends. I met Diana Valdez at a financial literacy seminar in February of 2023. This sounds unlikely, but it is completely true. There was a free seminar being hosted at a hotel conference room near BGC geared toward expats navigating Philippine tax obligations and investment options, and I attended because I had some genuine questions about my financial situation as a part-year resident, and because free information from credentialed people is still information worth having. The room had about 30 people. Diana was one of the presenters. She was 40 years old, Filipina, and she presented a segment on retirement asset structuring for foreign nationals with a clarity and confidence that I found immediately credible. She knew her material. She fielded questions from the audience with patience and precision, and she did not overpromise the way that people selling financial products tend to do. She said, more than once, that the right structure depended on individual circumstances and that she would not generalize where specifics were needed. That caution, that professional restraint, was what made her feel safe. I approached her after the seminar with 2 questions about my own situation, relatively straightforward questions about how my US-based investment income was treated under Philippine tax rules for part-year residents. She answered both of them on the spot, correctly as far as I could tell, and then said that if I had more specific questions, she was happy to schedule a proper consultation. She handed me a business card, Diana Valdez, Certified Financial Planner, with a firm name and a BGC address. I emailed her 2 days later to schedule the consultation. We met 3 times in February and March. The consultations were professional and useful. She reviewed the summary of my financial position that I shared with her and made several observations that were genuinely helpful adjustments to how I was thinking about currency exposure, a clarification about a withholding treaty provision I had misunderstood. She charged me a reasonable flat fee for the 3 sessions, which she invoiced properly and which I paid without any concern. Everything about the engagement was clean and straightforward. In the 4th meeting, in late March, she mentioned an investment opportunity. She described it as a private credit vehicle, essentially a structured loan to a portfolio of Philippine SMEs managed by her firm, paying a fixed annual return of 11% with a minimum commitment of $100,000. She said she was offering it to a limited number of clients who she felt had the right financial profile for it, and that she was mentioning it to me not as a pitch but as information because she thought it might be relevant to my situation. She was not warm or persuasive about it in any personal way. She was just informative. She said if I was interested, she could send me the product documentation and I could review it at my own pace. I said yes, please send it. The documentation arrived 2 days later. It was a 30-page product disclosure document, dense, formatted like a real financial product document, full of the kind of language that a financial planner would produce and that a layperson would find impenetrable, but that I, having spent 30 years reading contracts, found reasonably navigable. The key terms were there: fixed 11% annual return, 12-month initial lockup, quarterly interest payments, minimum $100,000 commitment. The underlying portfolio was described as a pool of secured SME loans across 5 industries. The firm, she wrote in a cover note, had been operating this vehicle for 3 years with 0 default events. I sent the documentation to Owen Carr on a Tuesday morning with a note asking him to review it before I made any decisions. Owen is not a financial products specialist, he is a business attorney, but he has broad legal experience and I trust his read on documentation more than I trust my own. He called me on Thursday. He took his pause, then he said, "Blake, I have a few concerns about this." He said the firm name on the documentation was not findable in the Philippine corporate registry in the way he would expect for a 3-year-old operation. He said the disclosure document had several structural gaps, places where a real product would specify the legal mechanism, and this one referenced it without defining it. He said 11% fixed returns on SME credit was not impossible but was toward the aggressive end of what would be realistic in the current rate environment. He said specifically, the documentation is not adequate and the investment structure does not make sense to me. I think you should be very careful. I thanked him. I told him I would be careful, and then I spent the following week having 2 more meetings with Diana in which she answered my follow-up questions with the same calm competence she had shown throughout, and by the end of those meetings I had decided that Owen was being overly cautious, which was, I told myself, his job, and which did not necessarily reflect the actual risk profile of the investment. I also told myself, and I want to put this down plainly because it is the most important part of what I am about to tell you, that my interest in Diana had shifted somewhat. Not dramatically, not into anything I would have described as romantic at that point, but she had become someone I looked forward to seeing, and I was aware that looking forward to seeing her was influencing how I weighted her explanations against Owen's concerns. I was aware of it, and I discounted it, and I sent her $165,000 in April of 2023. The first quarterly interest payment arrived in July. $4,537.50, which was exactly right at 11% annually on $165,000, deposited directly to my Philippine bank account. I sent Owen a brief note telling him the first payment had come through and that everything seemed to be in order. He replied with a single line, "Good, keep monitoring it." I read that reply as a concession, as Owen acknowledging that his concerns had been overstated. I now understand it as a man who had said what he needed to say and had nothing more to add until events proved him right. Between April and September of 2023, I saw Diana 8 times. Some of those were formal investment review meetings. Some were dinners that were framed as client relationship maintenance and felt more personal than that. She asked about Carol once I had mentioned my wife in passing during one of the early consultations, and the way she asked was careful and kind and genuinely attentive. She did not make it a moment. She just acknowledged it and moved on. I noticed that. I'm telling you, I noticed it because it shows you where I was, emotionally, by the middle of that year. A woman who handles grief carefully is something a widower notices. I noticed it, and I did not examine what that noticing was doing to my judgment, which is the error that all the subsequent errors grew from. In September, she approached me about a second investment opportunity. She described it as a co-investment alongside the existing vehicle, an opportunity to participate in a specific tranche of commercial real estate bridge loans that her firm was structuring for a portfolio of small developers. The minimum commitment was $100,000. The return structure was slightly different, a blended rate rather than fixed, targeting 12 to 14% annually. She said my existing investment was performing well and that clients in that vehicle were being offered first access to this co-investment as a matter of priority. She said she had limited capacity and that if I was interested, I would need to make a decision within 2 weeks. I sent the documentation to Owen the same day she sent it to me. He called me the following afternoon. He did not take his usual pause. He said, "Blake, I want to be direct with you. I am more concerned now than I was in April." He said the structure of the new vehicle had the same documentation gaps as the original, and that some of the language in the new document was identical word for word to language in the original in places where the products were described as being different. He said the 2-week decision deadline was a pressure tactic inconsistent with how a legitimate firm would operate with an existing client. He said the fact that the first quarterly payment had arrived was not evidence that the investment was sound, that a payment arriving was the easiest and most common mechanism used to build confidence before a larger ask. He said, "She is asking you for more money 6 months after the first investment. That is the pattern I would expect to see if this were not what it claims to be. I want you to hold off on any further commitment until I can investigate the firm's registration more thoroughly." He was right about everything. Every single thing he said in that phone call was accurate. I knew he was careful and experienced and had no personal stake in being wrong. I also knew, and felt with a clarity I am not proud of, that accepting what he was telling me would require me to stop seeing Diana in the way I had been seeing her, not just as a fraudster I had been fooled by, but as a person I had been allowing myself to care about. Admitting the investment was suspicious meant admitting that the relationship around it was suspicious, and I was not ready to do that. I told Owen I appreciated his concern and that I would take more time. Then I called Diana and asked her to extend my decision window by a week, which she did without any pressure, which I used as evidence of good faith, which it was designed to be. At the end of that week, I had a dinner with Diana at a restaurant near the waterfront. It was not a formal meeting. She wore something that was not business attire, and the conversation was easy and warm, and she asked about my sons. I have 2, Marcus in Denver and Joel in Seattle, with the kind of genuine curiosity that makes a person feel seen rather than studied. When I walked back to my apartment afterward, I knew I was going to send the money. I knew it the way you know things you have already decided and are just waiting to execute. I sent Owen a message that night saying I was proceeding with the second investment on my own judgment and that I was comfortable with the risk. He replied, "I understand. I've said what I need to say." 10 days later, I wired $100,000 to the account Diana had specified. The second quarterly payment from the original investment arrived in October again, exactly right, $4,537.50. There was no payment from the new vehicle, which Diana explained was due to the co-investment structure having a longer initial settlement period. I accepted the explanation. In November, the original investment payment did not arrive. I messaged Diana, and she replied within a day saying there had been a processing delay at the custodian bank, expected to resolve within 2 weeks. 2 weeks passed. I messaged again. She replied that there was an ongoing regulatory inquiry affecting the processing of payments, a sector-wide issue, she said, affecting multiple firms, and that she expected resolution by end of December. Her messages remained warm and prompt. She was never difficult to reach. She answered every question I asked. She just never gave me an answer that resolved into anything concrete. I called Owen in December. I did not tell him I had sent the second $100,000. I told him the payments had stopped and the explanations were vague, and I was concerned. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "Blake, when did you send the second investment?" I told him. He said, "How much?" I told him. He said, "All right, let me start making some inquiries." He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything except that he would start making inquiries, and that restraint cost him something, and I have not forgotten it. Owen's inquiries, conducted over 3 weeks in December and January, confirmed what he had been telling me from the beginning. The firm, Diana's firm, was registered in the Philippines but had been registered less than a year before our first meeting, not 3 years as she had claimed. The Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission had no record of the firm being authorized to offer the kind of investment product she had sold me. The corporate registration listed 3 directors, none of whom Owen's Manila contact could locate as real, actively operating individuals. The bank account to which I had made both transfers was registered to a different entity entirely, not the firm name on Diana's documentation, but a shell company with a similar name that had been incorporated 4 months before my first transfer. The first 3 quarterly payments, the ones that had arrived correctly and on time, the ones I had used to reassure myself and dismiss Owen's concerns, had come from that same shell account, funded by my own initial deposit, returned to me in portions to simulate a legitimate return structure. She had paid me 11% on my own money for 3 quarters to make me confident enough to send her more. The $4,537.50 that had arrived in July and again in October had come from the $165,000 I had sent in April. I had, in the most literal sense, paid for my own reassurance. And when I sent the second $100,000 in October, I had given her enough additional capital to sustain the illusion for one more payment cycle before it became more efficient to simply stop. She stopped in November. The December payment never arrived because by then she was done. I met with Owen in person in January of 2024. I flew back to Austin specifically for the meeting. He had laid out his findings in a written summary that I had already read twice before I sat down across from him, and he walked me through it methodically, the way he does everything, and when he finished, he looked at me and waited. I said, "You told me in April." He said, "Yes." I said, "You told me again in September." He said, "Yes." I said, "I ignored you both times." He said, "Yes." There was a long quiet between us. Then I said, "I'm sorry, Owen. You were trying to protect me, and I made it difficult." He said, "I know why you did. It doesn't make it easier, but I know why. That was the whole of it." He did not expand on what he meant. He did not need to. We had known each other for 22 years, and he had just watched me pay $265,000 to learn a lesson he had tried to teach me for free, and neither of us needed to explain the why more than he already had. The legal process in the Philippines has produced nothing useful. Owen connected me with a Manila attorney who filed an estafa complaint in February. Diana Valdez, the Filipina attorney, confirmed within a month that this was very likely not her real name, has not been found. The firm registration has been dissolved. The bank accounts are closed. The shell company has been wound up. Everything that existed as evidence of her operation has been administratively erased with the efficiency of something that was always designed to be temporary. My Manila attorney tells me the chances of any financial recovery are remote. Owen tells me the same thing from a U.S. perspective. I have accepted it in the practical sense. The money is gone, and the legal process is more about documentation than recovery. What I've spent more time on is the question I keep returning to about Owen. Not about Diana, Owen. The thing that sits with me is not the fraud itself. Sophisticated people construct sophisticated frauds, and some of those frauds work on careful people, and that is a hard truth, but a navigable one. What sits with me is that I had a person, a specific and trusted person with no stake in the outcome except my protection, who looked at the situation clearly from the beginning and told me exactly what he saw, twice, with patience and without drama, and I treated his clarity as an inconvenience, as something to manage and root around, because accepting it required me to accept something about my own state of mind that I was not willing to accept. I was in love with Diana. I have not said that to anyone except Owen, and I am saying it here because leaving it out would make this story dishonest, in the way that stories about financial fraud are often dishonest, presenting the loss as purely financial, as a question of due diligence and documentation, when the real mechanism was emotional. I was in love with her, or with the version of her that she had constructed for me, and that feeling made Owen's warnings sound like challenges to the relationship rather than what they actually were, information about the financial transaction sitting inside the relationship. I could not separate them. Every time Owen raised a concern about the investment, I heard it as a concern about Diana, and protecting her from his skepticism felt like loyalty rather than self-destruction. That confusion, the confusion between protecting a feeling and protecting myself, cost me $265,000 and nearly cost me 22 years of trust with one of the few people in my life who was consistently and reliably on my side. My son Marcus called me when he found out. He is 39 and works in financial services, and he had a measured response that was more painful than anger would have been. He said, "Dad, why didn't you call me when Owen first raised concerns?" I told him I had handled it myself. He said, "Right. That's what I mean. You handled it yourself instead of letting people help you." I did not have a good answer for that. I still don't. Marcus and I have a solid relationship, and he did not harden over this. But the question he asked is one I think about. Why didn't you let people help you? The answer is the same answer that explains why I ignored Owen, just in different language. I was managing the situation in a way that kept my feelings about Diana intact, and letting Marcus in would have introduced scrutiny I was not ready to face. I was not protecting the investment. I was protecting the feeling the investment was attached to, and I kept protecting that feeling until there was nothing left to protect. Joel, my younger son, took it differently. He called 2 days after Marcus and spent most of the call asking how I was doing rather than how the legal situation was developing. He asked whether I had been lonely in Manila. I told him yes, in the way that a person is lonely when the life they expected to have has changed shape in ways they did not anticipate. He said, "I should have called more." I told him that had nothing to do with what happened. He said, "Maybe not directly." He was right, in the way that younger children sometimes see the edges of things more clearly than the rest of the family. My loneliness in Manila, the specific quality of it, the way it mixed with the end of my career and Carol's absence, and the slightly untethered feeling of a man whose purpose has become unclear, was the condition Diana operated in. She did not create it, but she found it and she used it, and the only way to have protected myself from her would have been to understand how much I was carrying before she showed me a version of myself that felt lighter. Owen and I had lunch together last month. It was the first relaxed, non-business meal we had shared in almost a year, and the fact that he agreed to it without any formality told me the strain between us had moved back towards something easier. We did not talk about Diana or the money for most of the lunch. We talked about his daughter's law school graduation and about a property dispute he was working on that reminded him of our 2009 case, and about a restaurant near his office that had recently changed ownership. At the end of lunch, when we were waiting for the check, he said, "Are you going back to Manila?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "If you do, call me before you do anything with your money." I said, "I will this time." He nodded. We paid the check and went back to our respective days, and that was enough. Some repairs do not need ceremony. They just need the next ordinary thing to go normally. I am telling this story because of Owen. Not for sympathy, not to warn people against financial planners in the Philippines, not even to explain the mechanics of what Diana did. I am telling it because of the specific, painful, entirely preventable nature of what happened between me and my attorney. I had professional help, real help, from a real person who knew me and had no interest in misleading me and who identified the problem accurately from the first look and communicated it clearly, twice. And I made myself unavailable to that help because receiving it would have cost me something I was not ready to give up. That is not a story about financial fraud. That is a story about what happens when we decide that protecting a feeling matters more than accepting the truth that threatens it. The most expensive thing I have ever done is dismiss someone who was trying to help me. More expensive than any deal that went wrong, any partnership that soured, any market that moved against me. Because in all of those situations I did not have someone sitting across a desk from me, pausing before they spoke, saying plainly and without agenda, "Be careful." I had that here. I had that twice. And I chose, both times, to be something other than careful. That is $265,000 worth of choosing, and I carry it.